Hello, my name's Heidi, and this is the second video of this Archway drawing where I show you how I add shading and lighting to the drawing. Now I'm starting over on all the way over to the left side. The reason why I'm doing this is because when we're adding the shading and lighting, after we get some of these details in, if I were to accidentally smudge it with my hand, that might kind of ruin what I did. And so because I'm right-handed and my hand is going to be to the right of the pencil, I'm starting on the far left side so that I don't accidentally smudge things that are to the right of what I'm drawing. And so I'm starting on this wall, which is one of the darker spots of the drawing, and I'm starting out with my 8B pencil to get some of those really dark marks in there, and then I touch it up a little bit with my eraser, my kneaded eraser, and go in with some more details with that 8B. Then I take a lighter pencil, probably a 3B or so, and I'm going in and putting some of those lines in there, and some of the shading, and just to kind of get some color in there so it's not all white. I like to start with kind of a middle ground, and then I like to make it lighter and darker as it goes along. I'm taking that smudging stick and I'm just making it sort of that middle color so that I can have a kind of more of an even surface when I put some more of the details in there. I'm using a few different kinds of erasers here. One that is a skinnier eraser that helps me get very fine lines, and the kneaded eraser is good for getting erasing very softly and getting subtle marks with the eraser. I'm going in with looks like a 3B again, and putting some darker marks in there and then smoothing it out with one of the smudging sticks, and then using that kneaded eraser to soften it up in a few spots. And then taking 2B and making a very fine line and softening it up a little bit. Now with a lot of these, the details that I'm doing on the archway especially, there's a lot of back and forth, trying to get just the right tone that I want to match the image that I printed off. It can be challenging trying to take a color image and make it into a black and white image. Challenging because there are some differences that are shown in the drawing that are hard to tell that they're different tones because they're different colors, or hard to show that they're different tones, or they might be roughly the same tone but they're different colors, so they look different in the color image. And so sometimes even when you're doing a drawing, you have to change things a little bit to make it look better in a graphite drawing, because it might just be too challenging to show the differences if you kind of stick to how it actually looks in the actual photo. Also, it can be kind of nice to change things. You have a little bit of artistic freedom, because if you try to make it exactly how it is in the picture, then what's the point of doing it as a drawing rather than just keeping it as a photo? And so it's up to you. Maybe you're just wanting to copy an image for practice, and you want to get it as close as possible. Both are good to do, so it just depends on what you are wanting to do artistically with the drawing. And so with this section here, I'm just going back and forth between some smudging sticks and some of the B pencils, and then I'm making the center part of the archway a bit darker as it is in the image. And then I'm lightening it up a little bit with that kneaded eraser. And it can be challenging in some bigger areas like this because it just kind of gradually changes from darker to lighter. And so, like I've said before, it's a lot of back and forth trying to get it just the way that you want it to be. You'll notice that some of the smudging sticks are darker on some sides. That is just because I've been using them, and so they've got kind of a almost preset color to them. I usually like to keep one side that's a little bit darker and one side that's a little bit lighter. And then if I'm wanting to darken a section, I'll use the darker side to do that. And if I'm not wanting to necessarily darken it, then I'll use the lighter side, and usually it still kind of darkens it a little bit still, but you can always go in with that kneaded eraser and lighten it up a little bit. If you're using your smudging stick and you're finding that it's got too much lead on it and it's making too dark of a smudge, then you can take that sandpaper, and you might see me use it. I think I used it a few times in this drawing. You can take that sandpaper and just rub it along there, and it will lighten it up quite a bit. Now I'm starting to go into the sky a little bit, because I'm wanting to make sure that I'm comparing the tone of the archway to the sky in a way that makes them look different. Like I said earlier, it's kind of hard when they're different colors, but sort of close to the same tone. And so I'm going back and forth. I'm trying to stay away from the spots that are white in the sky, just because it's hard to get that white back after you've made a mark on it. So I'm going back and forth to make it a light tone but with some color in it. Now I'm going to go into this railing here that is the very light colored railing. And it's challenging because you want to make some marks but not too many, so I'm going in with one of my hard pencils. I think it looks like it's a 2H, and making just a few marks there so that you can tell that there's a little bit of detail but not too much so that it doesn't look white anymore. And just putting a little tiny bit of color on that light colored wall. Now I'm going into the mountain, darkening some of those with a 2B pencil. And then I will go in with one of the harder pencils, looks like a 3H, so I can make some dark marks but not have them too dark. And then I'm just kind of making it a little bit smoother with that smudging stick. Like I said, it's a little bit dark here, but you can lighten it up with that kneaded eraser. And then put a few more marks in there with one of the hard pencils to make it just a little bit more rigid in a few spots. Then going in with one of those hard pencils into the water, make it a pretty solid color and lighten it up in a few spots. Then go in with 2H and 3H and put a few lines in there just to give it a little bit more detail. Now I'm going into the little house in the foliage back there and using a 4H pencil, and then just smoothing it out a little bit to get some of that base color in there. And then I'll lighten it up a little bit with the erasers. This is one of the areas where I had to change a little bit just to make some parts stand out a little bit better. And so I'm just going in with mostly a hard pencil, but occasionally, like now with the rocks, I'm doing a bold, or just a regular B pencil. And then just trying to make some parts look darker, some parts look lighter to kind of mimic the patterns on the rocks in the picture. And then just doing some marks with some hard pencils for the foliage there. Now I'm going to start going into this pathway here. Just again trying to get some of that base color in. Tricky part about doing a drawing that is mostly focused on volume rather than the contour lines is that you want to make sure that you don't have too many of those lines showing, because in real life they normally don't have like a line that shows you where something is. It's just a color change or a shadow or something like that. And so here I'm going in with a B pencil and just giving it a little bit of texture and doing a little bit of those tricky shadows that are created from the railing. And with this part of the drawing, I don't use the smudging stick because it gives it a little bit of texture that I like, and I want to keep it there. And again, just going in with that bold pencil where there's the shadows. Now here I'm just sort of mapping out where there are the lines on the walkway. And the walkway gets a little bit tricky because there's a lot of detail in it. And so I try to mostly focus on the shading at first, and then I put a little bit more detail in there as we go along. So just kind of trying to get the right base tones to start out with, and then making it a little bit darker in a few spaces, trying to mimic the shadows on the walkway. Notice that as the lines move back into the image, they get smaller and closer together. That's part of the perspective that I was talking about in the last drawing, where as things kind of move back, you can see them get closer together. And just putting a little bit more shading in here just to make it stand out from the pathway, because I think that the colors were getting a little bit too close together even before I put the shading in there. And then just putting a little bit of lines in where there are where you can see the bricks. And I'm using a combination of hard and bold pencils in here. Where I make the darker lines, that's where the bold ones are, and the lighter lines are the harder ones. And then just making it a little bit darker where there are some of those darker stones. And there are a few highlights on the pathway, and so I'm using my skinny eraser to bring those out. And then I'll go back in with a B or HB pencil. I think I'm going between the two, and pull in some of those shadows that were coming through. I'm just giving a little bit more texture to that pathway, or the cobblestone. Now I start going into the railing, which is also very tricky just because there were a lot of little spaces and a lot of little details. But I started out by doing putting marks where it's a little bit darker, just to give me something to start from. And then I started filling in some of the other shaded spots with one of the harder pencils to start out with, just so I didn't make it too dark. This was one of those areas where it was very tricky because they were similar tones, but they were just different colors. And so it took a lot of back and forth to decide what I wanted to do. And so you'll see a lot of mark making and a lot of erasing in this part of the drawing. And there I just taking a like a 2H pencil to kind of make some of the lines in there to give it a kind of a base color. And if you are doing a drawing where you're struggling to decide if something just doesn't look right, you're trying to decide how to make it look more correct, it's good to step away from it, maybe take a picture of it or look at it in a mirror can help. Ultimately, it's better to make the picture look good rather than stick to the drawing. So if you have to do something to make the drawing look a little bit better, but doesn't exactly fit along with the how the original picture is, then I think that that's okay, as long as you are happy with the outcome. So now that I'm happy with how the railing in the center of the drawing looks, I'm going to move on to the right side of the archway. I don't have to worry about smudging any of that center because I already finished it, so I was glad that I started out going from the left side of the drawing to the right. Here I'm just taking a 2B and going in and filling in some of the base color in. Another method is to just use your already colored smudging stick, and you can shade that in if you want to start with kind of a middle ground color. I usually prefer that way. I actually wasn't very happy with, you can kind of see in the video that some of the lines aren't really smudging very well, and so to avoid that, you can just scribble on a piece of paper and then rub your smudging stick on it and then rub that on the paper, and it'll darken it up a little bit. You can see me use that method in a previous drawing that I did of my dog Aria. I used that for the kind of background of that image. Here I'm just putting some more shading in and lightening up a little bit with that kneaded eraser. I'm using an HB to make some of those lines a little bit darker where they need to be. The downside to this method, where you start from, in this image particularly I suppose, where you start from the right and go to the left, the downside to that is that if I were to do it all in one time, then I could more easily match the left side of the archway to the right side. But because it's been a little while, I think in real time it was a few hours, or actually it might have even been the next day, that I did the other side, this side of the drawing. I maybe would have forgotten like exactly what pencils I used for which sections, and so it's a little bit harder to match that way. But like I said, it has its benefits too, in that I didn't have to worry about smudging anything. As I said before, with when you're doing a more realistic drawing, usually you want to avoid having the lines that you use in the contour drawing. Obviously, in some of this architecture, that is not the case, because there are you can see in the original picture, there are very fine lines where there are the shadows from the intricate designs of the architecture. So here I'm trying to smudge it a little bit more so you can't see those lines as well. Give it a little bit more shading at the bottom of that wall. And the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to work on these little stairs and the door. And the door was one of the easier parts just because it didn't have too much shading or detail. It just had these bars. And there are some parts that I had to lighten up a little bit, but it's really easy to do with the kneaded eraser because it doesn't take too much of the drawing away. So that's going to conclude this drawing of this Italian archway. I hope that you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next video.